Everyone. Thank you so much for joining our mental health forum today. My name is Eve Podzitek, and I'm the director of the Rush Wellness Program. We're thrilled to have you here today. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. If you have your phones with you, please do put them on silent so we're not interrupting the conversation. We will leave time at the end of this panel discussion for Q&A. For our folks who are tuning in online, go ahead and use the chat to put in your questions. For those here with us in person, Decca and I will be circling the room with a microphone, so just raise your hand if you have any questions. This is our second of 4 mental health forums. We're holding this space today to process what's been a really difficult time. Even before COVID, October was the time of year to pay attention. Studies show that online terms like depression, anxiety, fatigue, and stress surge during this time of year. October is broadly recognized as Depression Awareness Month, and Mental Illness Awareness Week is October 3rd through October 9th, and World Mental Health Day is celebrated on October 10th. This is the time of year to pay attention to ourselves and to each other. As a community, we can support each other through this hard time. Today, we are talking about mental health so that we are collectively more aware of how we feel and how we can support each other. Before we kick off these discussions, I want to make you all aware of the support available to you here at Rush. Oscar. The wellness pathways are an easy way for you and your peers to get support. We want you to get the right help right away. Starting from the bottom to the top, you will see scaled responses based on how you may be feeling. Know that as a Rush employee or student, you can always access direct support from mental health professionals. Let's use these pathways, these forums, to acknowledge that it's okay to not be okay, to acknowledge that we can support each other in our time of need, and to acknowledge that you are not alone. We are a community here at Rush. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Maddie McCready, who is our Wellness Chair in Student Senate. Maddie is a GEM nursing student. She's in her 4th term, and she received her undergraduate degree in applied physiology and psychology from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. As someone who has endured and overcome her own mental health challenges, Maddie is passionate about destigmatizing mental illness and improving access to mental health care. She's a dog lover, coffee lover, and loves early walks on Lake Michigan. Maddie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, it's nice to be here. As Eve said, I am Maddie. And our panel today is about whether it's making ends meet, a difficult relationship, living with a disability, or increasing work demands, life can be exhausting. And so we're just going to talk about the general psychosocial strains. Before I introduce our panel, something that happened just last night, I decided to go to dinner with a friend. We're trying to balance being social, taking care of our mental health. She's a resident at Northwestern, but we still have COVID. So we're like, we'll go out to eat, but we'll eat outside. Within a few minutes of sitting down, down in River North, a car backfires. Our initial instinct was to duck. Chicago gun violence has increased 50% in just the last year. It's hard to even go out to eat now without worrying between COVID, gun violence, life is just hard. And I think in our profession, it's only going to get harder at this point. So I'm glad y'all are all here and welcome. So our panelists today, starting with my left, is David Bernstein. He is a primary care physician and assistant professor at Rush. He graduated from Rush Medical College in 2016. He completed his internal medicine residency at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After he finished his general internal medicine, a fellowship at Northwestern, he specializes in serious complex illness, psychosocial strains, and aspects of healthy living. He is personally interested in burnout, trauma, chronic pain, spirituality and healthcare, and grief. you. Our second panelist is Rebecca Leahy. She is the manager of mental health and social work and community health and the manager of clinical operations at Rush Wellness Center, just across the street. She oversees the psychotherapy services provided by her team of clinicians to Rush staff, students, and the community members, and is an instructor in the Department of Social Work in the College of Health Sciences here. Rebecca's adjustment to major life transitions. Rebecca's background is in bilingual psychotherapist with expertise in trauma, depression, anxiety, and adjustments to major life transitions. She received her master's in social work from Loyola after finishing her graduate degree from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Next, I have Sharon Gates. Sharon Gates is the Senior Director of Student Diversity and Community Engagement within Rush University. She is also an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work. She oversees the Rush Community Service Initiatives programs, also known as RICSIP, and engages student experience around diversity and inclusion within the university. She received her master's from the University of Chicago, and she just graduated with her doctorate degree from the University of Southern California just last year. And last but not least, we have Kathy Delaney. She is a professor in the College of Nursing in the Department of Community Systems and Mental Health Nursing. Through her many roles here at Rush, she has attempted to blend education, research, and practice. At the college, her roles include program director of the Psychiatric Mental Health Nurse Practitioner Program, and is now the project manager of the Nurse Practitioner Residency Program. Delaney's clinical work focuses on child mental health, particularly establishing new service models for underserved children with mental health issues. These are our panelists. All right, so I see we have some more people filing in. Just grab some food and sit down. But we'll start with our questions. Our first question for the panel is, what do we mean by psychosocial strains? And what are some examples you can share with us?
I'll start us off. Can folks hear me okay? Wonderful. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Maddie, Eve, and Decca for setting everything up. So I think Maddie gave some great examples as she teed up this panel, but when we think about psychosocial strains, we basically want to normalize the human condition. We as human beings don't exist in a vacuum, and we are impacted by our environments, both at school, work, home. We're impacted by our financial strains or otherwise. We're impacted by everything around us. So we want to think about how do we not just think about mental health symptoms and how those things might be showing up, but we also want to think about how this is important in the context of who we are as human beings, which is something that is really difficult to do, especially when we're striving for balance. So I think that's just to kind of get us started off, but wanted to ask my other panelists to join in too with examples.
So to build on that, it was hard to take care of people before the pandemic. And what's happened now is there's a lot more need from patients, a lot more that we have to draw upon from ourselves. I think some of the examples that you say about how our lives outside of the healthcare setting has changed. What we're focusing on today, though, the psychosocial aspect, in my view, it's the feeling of being pulled in so many different directions that it's hard for you to take care of the things that you need to take care of. So psycho means thoughts, but if you're preoccupied and worrying about something like fears of catching COVID, and that's pulling you away from focusing on the work that you have to do, or many of us and many of my patients have more social stressors where it's, how do I get to my job? How do I take care of my kids? How do I take care of my elderly mother or grandmother who's now isolated at home? So what's happening now is many of us have psychosocial stress or pressure, and it's how do you keep up with those, keep yourself healthy enough, and then deal with that in the context of all of us are in this healthcare setting where our job is also to take care of people who have tremendous needs and request so much of us, and then we can't do the job that we feel like we can do or want to do. So that's what I look forward to talking about today.
Thank you. Just to kind of go off of that, something I thought about, David, from what you said was, we have all these strains pulling us in different directions. And, I was just a little girl when 9/11 happened, but something we struggled with was, with both the election of 2020, but also January 6th, 2021, we were all in class on Zoom and we just wanted to turn off our cameras, turn off class. But it's hard because when we become providers, you can't just leave the patient at the bedside. And so I think that's something that we definitely need to talk about more is how do we balance those thoughts and those pulls while also providing for our patients? So moving on to the next question, how do these strains show up at home with our children, our family members, our partners? How do psychosocial strains show up here at Rush, in the classroom, or in clinicals? What are some examples that y'all have seen as both students and as providers?
Am I on? Okay, thank you. So many of the students know me as someone that they can come to and have conversations with. And I can't help it, I'm a mom. And I'm always looking for signal signs. And one of the things I watch for, okay, is this student taking care of themselves physically? Are they addressing their own personal hygiene? I mean, their hair, their attire. And one kid, I said, okay, I'm gonna buy you a new shirt because you keep wearing the same. And that's someone to me that is having a difficult moment. Or when I see students and in the hall and I see, there was a student a few weeks back that was crying in the hallway, and that concerned me. And so I went to that student, pulled them in, and just started the conversation and guiding them to the wellness center, to their faculty, addressing the problem. So just paying attention to those nuances that that are not typical, that I don't see every day in student engagement.
Hi, I was asked to speak a little bit about how children might show strains. And I think, you think of children about 4 to 10, and you start thinking about irritability in your kids. I say that with a caution that most pre-adolescents are irritable. So any of you with and they're irritable, get ready. But when all of a sudden your young child who is increasingly irritable at night, preoccupied, worried, that's a time to be concerned. I think that what we're seeing right now, those of us in child mental health, were always thought that after a year of being home for a million different reasons, it was going to be hard to go back to the classroom for kids. And last week, a child we talked about, for this child who was in about 2nd grade, it was a return to the kids who used to bully him. And it was a return to all the things that child had not coped with for a year. And now they were all back. And that's hard because, the first response is, let me just go back online. So that's what we're concerned about now is kids that are going back, that have had some issues and are confronting them again. How do we help them with that and keep them in school?
Thank you, Sharon and Kathy. Just touching off of what you said about going back to school, I know many of us are even just trying to cope with how do we find the 20 minutes to commute or to look presentable. We used to have that time to sleep or eat or work out. And now, we're having to cope with kind of the loss of just some time. And, we all have very limited time as students and providers. So going off of that and all those psychosocial strains that may come up at home or at school, what are signs of negative coping strategies And how can we be more aware of what these negative coping strategies may look like?
So I remember when I was a medical student, and it was obviously pre-pandemic world, but with medical school, and the pressure to study as much as we had to study, you kind of get tossed into it and you roll into it. Whatever strategies you have is what you work with. And I think there are similarities in a professional setting as well. And what happens though at some point is, when you're being pulled in too many different places, some of those approaches start to fall apart. So when I talk to medical students or my patients, like the obvious point at which you might want to check yourself is if you're cutting out the behaviors, and check yourself to say, maybe something needs to change here. And we could talk about that. And there's a lot of things that can change to make things more healthy or less stressful. The obvious stuff is if you have a really good workout routine where you're working out 120 minutes a week, and then you're starting to cut that back, it's okay, don't cut your healthy behaviors for these stressful activities. That's typically can be a tough approach. Or if you know that you need 8 hours of sleep a night to function the next day, and you're studying until 12 o'clock, or maybe if you're at home and you put the kids to bed and you finally pay the bills that were sitting on your thing for a couple of weeks, and then you finally clean the kitchen and it's midnight or whatever. But when you're cutting on these really important healthy activities, sleep, exercise, nutrition planning and diet planning, running to McDonald's, when you start cutting back on those, that's an opportunity to say, hey, is there something I could do differently? And I'll say, if you're not aware of those things yet, how much sleep you need, if you're not exercising, but those are opportunities to try to, add those spaces where you can. And that takes a long time, and it takes practice and oftentimes friends, and it's kind of a separate conversation. But the point is, I think some of these negative coping strategies that stick out to me is when the healthy behaviors start to fall away for these stressful, important things. And you have to think if that's really the best approach, or is there a different approach that you could take?
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to touch on? No, we can.
I think the only thing that I'd like to add is just looking for some of the behaviors that do have a negative impact over time. So some folks, especially during the pandemic, have been turning to alcohol a lot more, turning to other drugs, and even using food as a coping mechanism, like Dave mentioned. So I think in addition to being a balance of what does work for you, we maintain those types of behaviors, also trying to think at what point are some of the behaviors I'm engaging in now, or are some of these maladaptive ways that I'm coping sustainable, or am I doing this more than I typically would? So again, kind of looking for those signs and signals to just check in with yourself and see what changes might need to be made to have a better balance as you try to prioritize your wellness.
I also put a very positive framing on what I put. I mean, because there's so many ways to look at it. But then the other side, of course, negative coping strategies, avoidance, obsessiveness, compulsive behaviors too. If you have a test coming up, and so all you do is study for that test the whole time, that's not good as well. Those are the two that immediately come to mind to me. I'm not the psychologist, but hopefully that richens the discussion a bit.
Yeah, I think that avoidance and escapism are really, really big right now, especially with streaming and social media. It's another really important one to mention.
Just turning on your phone and scrolling, and then there is substance abuse and things like that. Although maybe Facebook is, what are they saying about Facebook now? That I guess it's as bad as who knows what. I didn't read those articles. So whatever that means.
Yes, those are all great examples. And David, like you said, studying, back when I was an undergrad, I had really bad anxiety, and this was before I got help. And I'd cope with my anxiety about my schoolwork by studying. They always say to study, but kind of there's that point of diminishing return. And I still remember, I also was having an eating disorder at the time, and to avoid the conflict of having to go out to eat, I chose to skip my best friend's birthday, just to study and to cope with that anxiety I was having. still remember that one. So yeah, those are all great examples. Like you said, Rebecca, about avoidance, I definitely think a lot of us are avoiding things, but also the obsession side. I remember at the beginning of COVID, I would constantly update my Twitter, my Instagram, Google search, just wanting to know answers to the point where that's all I did all day. But kind of going off of the negative coping can lead to just mental exhaustion. What are some signs that y'all see physically and mentally of like physical and mental exhaustion? And what are some ways that we can be more aware about not only ourselves, but with our peers and others and partners?
Well, I think one thing that is been true for 50 years is the idea that support mitigates stress. And we still see it in research that kids that are more engaged in school, kids that feel supportive at school, actually, it's a very supportive, it's actually very important against depression. So I think about that tangible support you can get, you're used to getting or had gotten in life, and don't take it, not take it for granted, but try to move some of that back in your life. Wherever you get your support from will help you with stress. You can email me if it doesn't.
One of the things that I want as a takeaway for us all is that we're all in this for each other. We're all in healthcare, no matter what roles we have or what discipline we're in. It's all about healthcare. And it's caring about that person next to us, that person in our classroom, our coworker, or the person you see in the elevator. And we need to develop a level of comfort, confidence in saying to someone that you see sobbing in the hallway and not walking by and letting that person just feel absolutely alone. And if you don't have that level of confidence and comfort in approaching that individual, then if you're on the 9th floor, come see me, 979, or any other faculty or any other staff, because we don't want anyone to ever say the words, I'm alone, because you're not. You're in a classroom of 30, 40, 80, 100, So we should never feel uncomfortable in offering our support and help. 2 weeks ago, I had an awful fall, and right now I can't see the faces of the students that helped me, but they helped me in such a way that it meant so much to me. And same here, mental health, not just physical, but mental health. Someone reaching out, please be responsive to them and direct them to where they can get support. Eve has already shared those places to go, those links, but certainly come to any staff or faculty.
I was going to say, on the topic of support, it's so important, and it's so different for different people. So I think one of the themes here is, if you're listening and you're either here because you know that you have too much psychosocial strain, or maybe you're listening and you're saying, wow, ooh, I think I fit some of those things. Like, a huge aspect of unloading some of that strain is drawing on the support that you have. And Omar Latif sent the email about supporting each other. And I think that's so important, that we do have each other during this really hard time, where we can draw upon each other for some support. And we have a number of wellness centers where you can go and get some individual attention. And also, I think an important aspect of maybe doing some counseling is having a chance to reflect on, what do I need, what needs to be better, or what needs to change so that I can make this better for myself. Some of that is individual therapeutic approaches and your own sort of approach to interpreting events, but some of that is making changes in your life. And then to do that, you're going to draw on your community. And so the question is, who's your community, who's in your community, who can help you, what changes can you make? Are you talking about just your family, that community, your friends, your religious community, your neighborhood? But I think when it comes to support, there's a lot of complex dynamics there that I think we should acknowledge, where different people have different levels of support. So if you don't have a lot of support, it's admittedly challenging. It's not to say it's impossible, but it can be a little bit more nuanced in terms of how do you get through psychosocial strain if we're telling you to rely on your support, but you feel unsupported. But the take home here, I think, is at Rush, we support you. And so there are resources available as a starting point in the meantime. And then I have patients who come to me like disability leave for depression, anxiety. We can do that too. So there's political, there's insurance benefits for support. There's a lot of stuff like that. Social workers know a lot about that stuff. So.
I think just to add on to what folks have already said, something that feels important to name in the current environment is just how difficult it is to make these connections right now. It's lovely to see so many folks in person. I know we have other folks joining virtually, but I think we've seen some of these natural kind of interactions that we would have in the workplace or in the classroom kind of fall away during COVID because we're trying to be safe and because we're separate. But I think this has led to a little bit less connection overall. So not having those side conversations with a colleague during lunch, or having that difficulty at the beginning of a WebEx meeting, trying to have some of those, again, more human connections around our life or what we're going through. So I think something that I'd encourage folks to do is just not to be afraid to check in with one another. I think sometimes there are more obvious signs and symptoms that we talked about that somebody might be struggling, but also for a lot of folks, it looks pretty just more, it looks a little bit more like irritability when they're not usually as testy as they're being, or it looks like they're withdrawing a little bit more, or maybe they seem a bit more on edge. So being able to, in a safe moment, in a moment when they're maybe not feeling in front of a group of people, just check in and let them know that it's okay to not be okay, see how they're doing, and then point them to the resources that David just mentioned. I think you don't have to be an expert in mental health to be able to just name that, hey, it looks like you might be dealing with a lot and there are resources to help, or I'm here for you and I'm here to hear about it if you do want to talk about it, because it can be really overwhelming to know where to start, I think. And again, without some of these more organic interactions that we might have had a couple of years ago, not that it should be taken for granted, it's important for us to know that it's okay to step forward and just to name to someone, I'm a person you can talk to, and it's okay to get help, and I'd be happy. I see that you might be going through something, because when you think about all of the psychosocial strains we've mentioned a few today, there's so many things that can cause pressure and stress outside of the classroom, outside of the workspace, but those are two stressors in and of itself. We're here because we want to care for people. We just have to care for ourselves first. And so I think helping one another to do that is really important.
Thank you, everyone. And y'all have brought up a great number of thoughts of my own. I'm just listening to y'all talk. Like Sharon, when you're talking about students needing help, this was last term, but I met a girl through volunteering here at Rush. It was the first volunteer opportunity in person. So, we're excited, awkwardly, socially, trying to interact, finding things in common. She had friends that went to my university with me. And something that we keep talking about is providing support. But I think there's something that we can even do more proactively, which is normalize our own struggles that we've had. I'm not shy to talk about my past experience, both with mental health and disordered eating. And, she had similar experiences, but she maybe wasn't farther along on her recovery. And just by talking to her about that and normalizing like these feelings you have about food and your struggle and feeling like you're never going to get better, like I can stand on the other side and say I went through that. And there's nothing better than having the feeling of someone reach out to you when they're most vulnerable and asking for help. And I was able to point her to Rush Wellness Center, and now she's seeing a therapist. So that's something I really want to emphasize, is normalizing that experience before they're needing to ask for help and support. Because I've also had very similar encounters back in my sorority, back in undergrad, is after I left for mental health and physical health leave, people were wondering, where'd you go in the middle of the semester? So I had to share. And I've had many students in my sorority come up and talk to me about those things. And I think it's just really important that we normalize that experience and share when you're comfortable and able, so that people know that they can turn to you for support. But moving on, since we've talked about mental exhaustion, how do you suggest we combat and cope with these exhaustion, psychosocial stressors? And how might these strategies change for our friends and loved ones and for our patients?
May I kick that one off and do a special plug for RICSIP, Rush Community Service Initiatives Program, 30 years of service. I want you to know that is a great place, just as Maddie brought up, a great place to meet people in volunteering, a great place to go and clear your head and get lost in the service, get lost in the conversation with someone who wants to share with you their journey in homelessness, or interact with a child who wants so badly to be you. So to go and volunteer and then take your emotional situation and put it on the shelf and open it up to someone else to share with you what they're experiencing, then you start to get a grip on, okay, they opened up to me. I need to open up to someone. I need to go and find help. But service is a great place to find a way, find your path, and also to relieve stress. So Rick's at 30.
You know, on a more one-on-one level, I was thinking, I read an essay on how we're gonna all cope as health professionals, and they said, one size doesn't fit all. At the end of the long essay, they said, you know, everyone will have different methods. And with that in mind, I'd like to just tell a little story first and then get to my point. I used to go to a meeting every Friday morning for 2 hours at a group of therapists, and I was kind of the psychiatric egghead person. And at the end of it, the leader they'd go around and say, what are you looking forward to this weekend? And my first meeting, I was like, oh my God, I have nothing, you know, I was just like, what am I going to say? But after a while, I got used to it. And people said things like, I'm looking forward to a movie that's coming out. I'm looking forward to seeing my sister. I'm looking forward to doing nothing. You know, it was this anticipation. And so how much are we anticipating right now? And what has that got to do with coping? So there's an idea of, it's called the tripartite model. I love theories of mind because it helps me understand a lot. And it's on one hand and depression's on the other, and in the middle is positive affect, and how important it is to keep a level of positive affect. And right now we're actually looking in my field, we're seeing positive affect therapy, but which means you really try to delineate the positive features of recent events and think about them. But another interesting study they did about people coping with COVID, they investigated how much people are using what's called meaning-centered coping. And that means your attitudes that include positive reframing, maintaining hope, but also life appreciation and engagement in meaningful activities, sociality. So as you're thinking about your life, also I think that your reward system in your brain, it is how you experience reward, but it also is the anticipation of a reward. And I think if we need to rebuild back that sense of looking forward, anticipating, and keeping our positive affect higher, I think it will help. Well, research says it will help cope.
I'm going to build off that. So two things that you mentioned there. One, positive affect, and two, like meaning, or how we make sense of all these things. There was an essay written by Dr. Arthur Kleinman called How We Endure. It was published in the Lancet years ago. And basically he spoke here I was a student here, so this is probably like 2015. But anyway, he's a Harvard anthropologist and psychiatrist. He wrote this essay called How We Endure. And it was basically a rebuke against the resilience language and mindset when we're dealing with ongoing, legitimate hardship. So he's an anthropologist, and he went to Sierra Leone and worked with the individuals there and studied the individuals there. And basically, what he took away was in the Sierra Leone, they dealt with famine and like, I'd have to reread. I'm not going to speak to it correctly, so I can't speak further. But it was a serious hardship that we don't quite deal with here. And what he took away from the culture was that there was like a positive framing around going through that hardship. So it wasn't like, I'm going through something bad, I'm going to hide it from everybody because I'm suffering and they're going to think I'm weak, so I'm going to hide it. It was, if you go through a hardship and you get through it, that's a sign of strength. That's a sign of survival and survivorship. So if you can get through something hard, the harder it is, the stronger you are, and maybe the better person you are, or something to that effect. But my point is just to say that, one, he said the idea of endurance, in that if you get through something hard, that makes you a better person, not a weaker person. So if you're going through something hard, it's okay. Okay. The other thing that he said, and I've heard this in other burnout discussions, is this idea of resilience. Just the word itself, it almost implies that you have like a bending and then something happens and you bend back to your normal shape or where you were before. Like metal is resilient, it can't bend it. I prefer the term endurance. I think it makes a lot more sense. You go through something happens, you move through it, you sustain, you survive, you grow, you change. You are not the same person at the end than when you started, which I think resilience sort of maybe is supposed to capture, but it's lost on me if that's the story. But you get through it. And I think, like with the pandemic, we all need each other to do that. With our individual hardships, like I kind of said before, then it comes to what's within you to find that, and your resources, and that's very individualized. Another good word is stamina. Like just how long can you last? Like, and I like those words more than resilience. And that again comes back to sort of positive framing, because I don't like the word resilience. I don't know about you guys. It feels very like you have to be strong. I don't like that. And then meaning making. How do you make sense of all this? How do we make it not so hard so it doesn't hurt so much?
Thank you. I think I'll just add one more piece. I think the last piece that Maddie asked was from a patient lens too. So coming from a social work perspective, I also want to name kind of the dynamics of power and privilege as we think about psychosocial strains on somebody's mental health. So recognizing that not everybody's coming in with the same resources or the same ability to access supports. I think David mentioned that before in terms of social supports is really important. So I think something, for example, Maddie mentioned before that just normalizing and sharing our own experience is helpful, but normalizing just asking these types of questions with our patients is really helpful. I know my home department of social work and community health has worked hard to integrate social determinants of health screening into a lot of spaces in the hospital. And it is a really big marker for how your patients will do, but how we do as well. So how our health is impacted by these social factors that we're all battling day to day, our health and our mental health, which is why we're here today. So I think recognizing that we all have biases that we come with in life. And when we walk into a room, whether we're assessing a patient or we're interacting with colleagues, recognizing that so that we can challenge ourselves when we're making assumptions is really helpful. And then also trying to bridge those gaps when there are resources that are available to certain groups and not to others, or when we need to, again, not make assumptions to try to figure out how we can best help someone. I think that that's also something really, really important to name when we think about combating or coping with psychosocial stressors.
We also haven't mentioned financial stress and the effect of financial stress on psychosocial strain, but that's not lost upon any of us. So I just wanted to make sure that that gets included at some point, here in our conversation.
Thank you, everyone. And yes, I can concur on that financial strain of trying to learn how to be an adult and pay taxes. So moving on, our final question, we have planned is, why is it important to establish and or reinforce your boundaries, and especially when supporting others or loved ones? And why does work-life balance matter?
I mean, this is one of my favorite questions, so it's okay. We don't have to argue to go first. I think that, I mean, okay, so boundaries is a really common topic that comes up in the therapeutic space. A little closer, thank you. Boundaries are a common topic that comes up when we're in the therapeutic space, and it's really important. And so something, and the other panelists will touch on other aspects of this, but something that I find really helpful to name and to reinforce is that we are often caught in a trap of assuming what others' needs are and then assuming that others know what our needs are. So even before we know what a boundary is or how we want to set a boundary, I think we need to figure out how to, one, our needs are. So David talked a little bit about that earlier, trying to understand what are my healthy coping mechanisms, how much sleep do I need, what sorts of supports are most helpful for me as an individual, but then also being able to vocalize that and normalize naming that with those around us. So we talk a lot in the Wellness Center about what does it look like when I'm overwhelmed or when I'm stressed. And it looks really different for me than it does for some of my colleagues. And what I need in that moment might be more discussion and more support, whereas somebody else might need a little bit of space. And so trying to figure out, again, within your circles, what that looks like is really helpful. And then not getting into that trap of resentment when somebody's not assuming what my boundaries are and they're not meeting my need, but I didn't exactly tell them what my need is. So I know this is multi-layered, that's just one piece of it, but I think that we often are mind readers or we think we're mind readers, nobody actually is. So that's one piece that I will name to get a discussion around boundaries and work-life balance, I think, kicked off, but I know others will jump in too.
You know, I think that if there's one thing COVID brought us, it was a renewed interest in mindfulness. Let's see, everyone's head, how many people have discovered it again. And I think we can use mindfulness in many different ways: stillness, stopping rumination, not stopping it, but controlling it. And I'm just going to go back one more time to the idea of positive affect. And we can use mindfulness to raise the hedonic sense of a reward, to make sure, you know, that when you're going to a farm market, maybe tomorrow, and it's a beautiful autumn day, to really try to absorb the pleasure of it and raise your positive affect. I think we can all do that. It works.
Okay. I just want to say one thing, something I learned from Dr. Lambert. No is a complete sentence. No is a complete sentence. And then the other thing that I just want to, in my portion of the conversation, to pay attention to your environment. We're always in a rush. We're always rushing. And I shared with Kathy as we were sitting here that the other night I wanted to reward myself with another tube of lipstick, even though you can't see it. It's beautiful. And I needed it, and it was the perfect color, and it said chocolate heat. And I just knew it just meant, hey, little did I know it meant plumping up my lips. And that when I put it on, that my lips would feel like they were on fire. So hence the chocolate heat. But my point is, yes, I was there. Yes, I made a point to go get my some new lipstick. But at the same time, even in that moment, I needed to stop and pay attention to what I was doing. So I have on chocolate heat if anybody wants to see it.
And really quick, going off of that, Sharon, not only is no a complete sentence, but your free time doesn't mean you're available. People see that calendar empty and they think that means you're available, and you're not.
And one other thing I want to add here is that this idea of balance or of setting good boundaries, it's not static. It's not like an achievement where it's done. I just want to name that it's a journey. My boundaries might shift over time, or what I need might shift over time. And I think that that's also something that is important to name when we think about all of the pressure that everybody in this room, everybody who's on the call puts on themselves. Everybody wants to do their best. And I think that in the fields that we've chosen, it's also that no is a complete sentence is really powerful. And I think we often challenge ourselves on that because we stretch ourselves for a patient or for a colleague. And so remembering that your needs are important, we can't pour from an empty cup. And then recognizing that even if I did this thing for Sharon 2 weeks ago, and I no longer, now I can't commit to that same thing in the future, it's okay to be able to adjust and again, continue to communicate about those.
So the last thing I was going to say about boundaries was I think it's important to recognize, like, one thing that I think about boundaries is if it's something that's within your control or if it's something that's sort of outside of your control. So like work-related exhaustion is really oftentimes a systems level issue that can be outside of your control. You hear leaders in the institution and healthcare administrators talk about mindfulness for that because it's the one thing that's been most clearly shown that you can do on your own to improve your own work burnout. But that's not to say it's the best thing for it. It's just it's the best thing that you can do on your own. So I think like a takeaway as you think about your own psychosocial strain is sort of what's inside of your control and what's not. And the things that are inside of your control is things like mindfulness, which can be very helpful to people. To some people, mindfulness is kind of hit or miss. If you think it's going to work with you, it probably will. If you don't think it's for you, maybe it's not the right time. So things like mindfulness and other strategies like that, healthy behaviors, asking for help. So if from this conversation you've identified some things that maybe could be better, ask for help. Your partner or your spouse or your friend or your parents or your siblings or your colleagues or your peers or Sharon or the wellness center. You can always ask for help. That's within your control. And then there's other things that are outside of our control where you have to rely on leadership, whether it's like the university leadership for the curriculum or if it's institutional leadership related to your work responsibilities. But I think that's where, again, it kind of comes down to all us being in it together. And I think solidarity is very important too, where it's like, how do we kind of move through this ridiculous crisis together without like hating each other too much because of some of the particularities of what's going on in the larger context of things. So there's a lot, but I think that there's a lot of room still to have positive affect and to take away some meaning. And probably 5 to 10 years from now, we'll look on this and be stronger for it. So maybe I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you, everyone. In a minute, we're going to open it up for questions. One thing that I really wanted to touch on the boundaries is make boundaries with yourself. If you find yourself checking social media every 2 seconds or comparing yourself to the girl who's photoshopped her entire picture, have a social media detox. They're great.
The social media stuff came up recently before we like kind of dry ran this thing, but the social media is like, I deleted my Facebook a few years ago and I felt a lot better since. And seriously, everyone should probably get off of there. Like pick one. I'm on Twitter and I had this like Bears Twitter account that's mostly for fun, but like, think about it. I'm not so sure it's healthy.
All right, opening it up for questions. And I will, for those who are online, we're going to read questions from the chat, but I'm going to first open it up to those here in the room. If you want to raise your hand, you're welcome to do so. If I don't have any takers or we want to get started, I know that there are a couple questions already in the chat.
First, I want to just say thank you to all of you. And how I came to know about this forum was that it's the first time ever me expressing this, but I had just had a miscarriage and I was walking out and I noticed the advertisement for this. And then the same day I got a call and my husband pretty much was telling me that he had been dealing with some issues at work, but I guess I noticed and kind of didn't, because, you work these 8 hours a day, we come in kind of late, have to eat, and then we, go to sleep and prepare for the next day. But I hadn't noticed, and they pretty much let him go. It was a lot of discrimination and stuff going on there. Then that night, we received a text message that my niece had I wouldn't say a panic attack. What is it called? She had I'm losing a seizure. Had a seizure and she didn't come out of it. So literally all of that took place in that time, but I can really appreciate this, to know that this exists, especially in the work area, and to know that there is a possibility that we can get stronger outside of all of this, with dealing with life and then work and then the load of work and all of that. And so I just wanted to just say thank you. This is really great. My question to you would be, far as support, if you have already set your boundaries, you've already mentioned that you may need additional support within, I guess, your working capacity. And if there is nothing in return, what do you then do? How do you handle that?
Start us off, but I just want to say, first of all, thank you for sharing what you've been through. And it humanizes again why we're here today to talk about this. This is real life and this is what people are going through. So thank you for sharing. I think that something that can be really frustrating when we're working within systems or when we're even working within our own family is that we can't control what other people do. And we can't always control what the support looks like or how people are going to respond to us. And so without negating how frustrating and how painful that can be, so embracing that and understanding that that's okay to feel upset about that, I think sometimes it does really help to bring it back to like, what's my locus of control in this situation? So sometimes it is about some of these small behaviors, buying a lipstick, eating well, taking care of yourself, taking a step away, even if it's just for 15 minutes, but then also kind of grounding in, even if I'm facing some tough choices, what are the choices here? Because I think we often feel really stuck, especially when you have so much on your plate and we're feeling overwhelmed. So trying to recognize where can I empower myself to make a choice, even if it's between tough choices, can be helpful. But overall, being gentle with oneself too. When we're going through a tough time, it's not a linear process, and sometimes moving through it is the fastest way. So just some general thoughts, but thank you again for the thoughtful question. I don't know if others have other.
Again, a powerful story. I'm sorry you went through all that. I think that it makes me think that, we have pockets in Rush that are very focused on building healthier cultures. And I think we should talk more about them. Omar's email today was just so freeing, really, in helping us talk about this. And then you could bring up to someone, look at all the people around the university that are actually focused on how healthy is our culture. I think we need to concentrate on that a little more. So thanks for bringing that up.
I also just appreciate naming that the wellness center services and counseling available through that, it's not just for work-related stress, it's for everything that's going on, which is, again, I think why we chose this topic for the panel and why we're here today. So I just wanted to also reiterate that piece.
First off, I want to say thank you again for you guys for just hosting and opening this forum. I mean, I don't so much have a question as more as advocate as far as for the wellness program and just in general. So often we're used to daily stressors, and especially within the healthcare field, seeing that pain and suffering and or that type A personality of like studying and grinding through it, that often we don't think to seek resources or to seek help unless it's become a crisis situation. And so realizing that there is a lot of empowerment and resources in reaching out for that support to prevent that from getting to a crisis situation. And so the Wellness Center is completely independent. It doesn't have any documentation or reach over into the system here. And so it's one of those things that not only that, but there's so many other resources out there that I think removing the stigma around seeking help and also just opening that conversation in that way that it's a perfectly healthy and normal thing and something that probably everyone could benefit from having that third party to kind of debrief and go through things with. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I often think of what if we thought about our mental health like we did our physical health, right? You know, we get checkups, we go in pretty regularly. If you sprain your ankle, you don't ignore it. You know, I think we need to start thinking about how do we really take care of ourselves? And it's empowering, it's a strength, right? Just going to ask some questions here from the chat. So for the panel, a couple folks asked questions about how the strain of trying to observe COVID precautions and safety and then not being able to interact with those support systems that were, you know, maybe not observing those same precautions. So one person brought up a religious environment and another person brought up a school environment. So if you could just comment, how do you navigate those difficult waters when you are holding a boundary for yourself, but with that boundary, therefore, aren't able to access those support systems?
You know, it just comes to mind a good friend of mine who had we're all coping with those. What are we going to do with this invitation right now? And are we going to go? And a good friend of mine said something about why she wasn't coming to a book club we all belong to. And I think it was important to her that I supported her decision and that I listened to it. I don't know why I think it was, but it seemed important that she felt supported in that decision. So when you're making those tough decisions, talk about it. Talk about it out loud, maybe. Get your rationale. Feel supported.
You know, I do primary care here at Rush. I spend like probably 5 hours a week of my regular talking about this. Changes every week, changes every month. First things first, follow state and local and city guidelines because the individuals who make those rules know what they're doing. But the one thing I would say on this topic of how do we deal with the COVID life and social life, the one thing that I worry about the most is when people overestimate the risk of COVID at the risk of their own like mental or social health. So this summertime, for example, COVID, there was hardly any COVID out. There wasn't too much of it going around. We were able to go outside and socialize safely. And it was really a wonderful time to go to that barbecue, to go eat at that patio restaurant, to go do some of these safe activities. But now I'd catch individuals who weren't aware of that, or maybe were too afraid to do it. And some people are like staying at home and they're like, no, I just stay home and I feel good. And it's a bit agoraphobic, I won't lie, but they seem kind of happy and they're doing okay and that's fine. There's some people who are staying at home saying, I'm so afraid of COVID, I really just want to socialize. And that's sort of the pattern that gets more of my attention. But I think with COVID, like we need to find a place to understand the risk of catching COVID. We're never going to avoid it. It's always going to be around. And how can we just pick these safer behaviors, which is outdoors, well ventilated, with less people, with a little bit more distance, and just sort of maximize our enjoyment of those activities when we can. This winter, we'll see how it goes. I'm hoping that if this is a hard winter, I'm hoping it's like our last hard winter. It's kind of a wishful thought. I don't have any great science to back that up.
Thanks. And we'll take one more question. We have 1 minute left. So if there's anybody here in person, great.
So I wanted to speak to one of the words that was brought up, which was culture. And although Rush itself does a great job of promoting wellness and doing what it can from an organizational standpoint, what about like more broader? What could we do as individuals on a more systematic level? For example, like capitalism. it is a working economy where you have to work, 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 and there's not a lot of vacation or reward time to take those mental health breaks. So how do we go about changing that? I know it's a kind of a broad, more philosophical question, but if you have any insight into that of what we can do, maybe we can start affecting change.
I think that you bring up a good question that none of us probably have a proper answer to, because it's a big one. But I think that it's important to name that, again, we're here talking about psychosocial strains. Going back to what I said in the beginning, human beings don't exist in a vacuum. We exist within these systems. And so I think part of it is leveraging our voices when we can to advocate for systems change or for culture change. That depends on your position, how safe you feel doing that in certain environments, et cetera. But I think that the other piece is also trying to find that balance and that empowerment that I talked about before within the systems that we're in. So how do I leverage the tools that I have or the days off that are available to me to really take care of myself? And how do I focus on what I can do versus what I can't do? Because that's when we get stuck too. So I think it's a little bit of both. We want to make change from the top down, where cultures are better, where systems are better. But then also in the meantime, I want to focus on what I can do myself. So not a silver bullet to be able to fix the larger issue, because you're right. We're in a culture that values hustle, that values perfectionism, all of these types of things that sometimes can be detrimental. And so it's focusing on, okay, how do I participate in that enough to, again, make my paycheck and feel good about what I'm doing? But then how do I also balance that with taking care of myself and, again, leveraging the supports that might be available?
All right. Thank you, everyone. Any last minute comments from the panel? Well, that is the end of our event. I would say I have one closing thought regarding the balance of COVID for whoever asked that question. I also wanted to just speak and normalize the process of trying to re-enter society. I went to a wedding back in Texas back in June, and I started crying at the sight of no one wearing masks. So if that says anything, it's hard, both trying to balance it, but also trying to go back to normal things. So be gentle with yourself. And thank you for coming.